Welcome back for another Friday Night In with 10-Minute Horror. This episode is lucky number 13, and we hope it meets you well tonight. So mix yourself a stiff one, and let's get into it. This is RIVEN. We'd always wanted a cottage, somewhere to escape, away from the city and noise. Even before the kids, it was always a shared goal for Molly and I. Then, our children, Sophie, Bree, and Devin, came along, and more realistic dreams took over. But we still saved and fantasized, and through the years found ourselves with a sizable enough chunk of a deposit. We weren't retired yet, and the kids were still in their teens, but we started looking anyway. When the RIVEN property came on the market, we could almost touch our retirement project. It was a gorgeous property with rich land, about 8 acres of woods, and housed a large, pre-century cottage with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement. It was an absolute fixer-upper, but a manageable one, and the online pictures of the interior had Molly so excited. The property was a bank repossession and was within our range. We had a shot, but it went way above asking, so we kept looking. A year passed and nothing else was in our range. Not that we saw anything we really liked. The closest thing was a cottage that was more of a cabin. You could barely fit a shadow in it, let alone a family of 5. So we continued looking, but the dream got smaller and more distant. Then, the RIVEN property came back on the market, and at a lower list price. We quickly made an offer slightly above asking, and 2 hours later, we were driving to the bank to sign the papers. I'd never seen the light in Molly's eyes so bright. I remember the 2 of us driving there. What a perfect day. It'll be one of the ones I remember at the end of my life. We finally owned a cottage. A week later, we picked up the keys. It was the beginning of March break, and the kids didn't have any trips planned this year, so we decided to go up for the full 9 days. I'd have to come back into the city during the week for scattered work shifts, but would be able to spend most of my time at the cottage. The first weekend we spent cleaning the place. The kids all got to pick their rooms, and no one was overly upset about them. I started fixing up the furnace on Monday while the girls and Devin hit the lake. This is what I imagined. Working on the cottage while everyone went off and had fun. I'm not even being sarcastic. That's what I'd wanted. I was looking for something to work on and perfect. It'd never be finished, of course, but that meant I'd always have a purpose. Outside of my family, obviously. And this furnace needed purpose. It kept shutting down at night. I had to work Tuesday to Friday night, so I drove back to the city and left them. Molly had her car, and they were stocked up for food, with a list of things to fix they probably wouldn't get to. Which was fine. They were mostly tweaks I wanted to handle anyway. I just wanted them to have fun. We finally owned a cottage. The week dragged on. I felt like Friday was never coming. I talked to Molly every night, and she joked that the renos were almost done. But she also mentioned on Wednesday that Devin seemed off. Devin was our youngest at 14. He'd been coming up a little soft, 2 older sisters pushing him around and all. He had a stutter from an early age, which I'd helped him get rid of, but the anxiety it came with remained in him. I'd also been trying to get him to stick up for himself more. I figured puberty would help with that, but it was taking its sweet-ass fucking time to arrive. Molly said since Tuesday, Devin hadn't ventured out very far from the cottage, and he hadn't been sleeping well either. He seemed overly anxious and nervous. I asked if Soph and Bree had been at him, but Molly said they'd been great, and actually trying to coerce him to go down to the lake. But he just wanted to stay in his room. I'd talk with Devin this weekend, spend more time with him. Work had always pulled me away, but now I had time to get close to my son, help mold him into a more assertive and strong-willed young man. Then the world ground to a halt. It was 2 a.m. on Friday morning, and I woke up to Devin standing over me, shaking my arm. What the hell was he doing here? Why wasn't he at the cottage? I felt the area on my arm where he grabbed me. It was damp and crusty. I looked at it and saw brown and red, dirt and blood. Then I realized Devin's hands and forearms were covered in both. He had tears in his eyes and smears on his cheeks from rubbing his face. Oh no, what happened? What did he do? I shot up out of bed and kept asking, yelling if they were okay, Molly and the girls, but Devin kept saying, no, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, it wasn't me. He couldn't say anything else. I could tell he either had a concussion or was in shock. I wasn't getting anything out of him, and he had that moon-faced look retired boxers have. I grabbed my cell and called Molly. No answer. Then Sophie. No answer. Bree. No answer. I tried Molly again, but nothing. I quickly got dressed and continued trying to get Devin to talk, but his stutter had returned in full force. He couldn't even say the simple phrases he'd been repeating minutes earlier. We got in my truck and hauled ass through the city to the highway. Devin had stopped trying to speak, and I'd given up on asking. There was no way to rush it with him, and it'd get worse if I tried. He was now just trembling and breathing quickly and heavily, staring at the blood and dirt on his hands in disgust. We drove the first half hour in silence, other than his teeth chattering. I tried to put together the few puzzle pieces I had of what was going on, and it was a terrible-looking image. Clearly, at the very minimum, one of the 3 girls had been badly injured at the cottage. That appeared to be the best-case scenario. I tried Molly's cell again. That was over a dozen times now. Still, no answer. Devin's breathing was easing, and I couldn't hear the stuttering impeding it any longer. Just as I thought to try to get him to speak again, he did. My blood ran cold. Every hair on my body stood straight up. I didn't believe it, but I could tell when my son was lying, and he wasn't. His story started on Monday night, when I left to go back to the city. He confessed he'd been smoking weed recently, buying some from a kid at school, and brought it to the cottage. At night, after everyone was asleep, Devin had been sneaking out, walking down to the water, and smoking. He apologized and said it helped with his anxiety. I really didn't care. I wanted to know about his mother and sisters. He continued on. While out the first night, he walked down to the lake to sit on a large, flat rock his sisters had been tanning on like a couple of lizards during the day. As Devin was smoking, something caught his eye, far down the stretch of beach. It was too dark to tell what the something was, but he thought it was a bear at first. Or maybe a deer? He got up to make his way back to the cottage, but saw that the figure was closer now, and it was more in the shape of a human, walking upright, but too dark to tell details. Something got into Devin's bones from the sight of it, and he turned and sprinted back to the cottage. He snuck back in and hid in his room until his sisters woke up the next morning. When they all went down to the beach that morning, Devin checked for footprints in the sand where he saw whatever he saw the night before, but there weren't any. The second night, Devin decided not to go to the water, but went walking through the woods instead. There was a clearing not far from the cottage he'd wanted to turn into his own personal fire pit and hang out, but on the walk there, he heard twigs cracking. He looked around, but couldn't see anything. He continued on to the clearing where he began to smoke, but the twigs kept snapping. Devin spun, looking for shadows in the woods, but saw nothing. Then he heard twigs behind him. Again he spun, this time catching them, but they weren't breaking. They were falling. Devin looked up and saw a figure floating amongst the trees. It was a woman. He didn't see her at first because she was covered in what looked like layers of black robes that had been frayed away, but his eyes adjusted and he saw her face, pale as eggshell, framed by long dark hair with streaks of gray. She didn't have eyes, but Devin could tell the woman was staring at him. Devin couldn't move. He said he was too afraid. Then the woman started floating down through the branches. Devin found his legs and took off. He ran back to the cottage and hid under the sheets again until the morning. When he woke up, he didn't want to leave his room. He was too afraid to venture out. He told Molly he wasn't feeling well and was going to stay in bed all day. He even took a knife from the kitchen and hid it under his pillow. That was Wednesday. Thursday night. Tonight, the woman returned. After everyone went to sleep, Devin wouldn't go outside, so he opened his bedroom window to smoke. But when he tried to open it, he saw the woman again. She was across the lawn, her feet floating a foot off the ground. Devin froze, unable to move again, and watched as the pale-faced woman glided through the air, across the lawn, and towards his window. Before the woman arrived, Devin managed to pull away, but shut the blackout drapes he had. He turned off all the lights in his room and hid under the covers again. But the room began to glow, a dark orange. The drapes became transparent, and the woman became visible behind the fabric. Then, she was on the inside of the window, her face pushing through the curtains as she floated forward, locked onto Devin. He said he didn't remember anything after that. He woke up in the living room, on the floor, covered in blood and dirt. He could see his bloody prints leading back up the staircase, but was too afraid to go and look. The only thing that made sense to him was coming to get me. He just wasn't strong enough on his own to look in the bedrooms. So that was it. My 14-year-old son got in his mother's car and drove an hour and a half into the city to get me. And now, we were driving back, but the last thing he managed to get out before the stuttering took over was the word witch. My mind raced through the possibilities of how bad things were, if there was indeed someone out there, and if they had invaded our cottage and attacked my wife and daughters. If the property was a repossession, it made sense that a previous owner maybe had a gripe, but how far would they take it? It's not like we took the land. I couldn't navigate all the loose threads of Devin's story, but the answers were getting closer with every new mile. We pulled onto the long driveway that winded through dense woods leading up to the RIVEN property. The woods felt darker here. Everything did. Even when the moon looked down on us, it was dimmed and felt like two nights layered on top of each other, like my high beams only showed me as far as the woods would allow. Then the lights hit something. Was that a chair? And a table? And Sophie's bed? Bree's? Mine and Molly's? All our belongings were on the front lawn. The house must be completely empty now. All our clothes and toiletries and dishes and paintings and furniture? What the hell was going on? I pulled the truck up and parked it, but kept the lights on. The cottage was built to be south-facing, so the headlights only punched in through the lonely back window and didn't give much idea to the happenings inside. The area was so quiet, it was impossible not to hear the idling of my truck. I kept thinking Molly would come out, safe and sound, asking what we were doing, that the girls would come out too, and I could see them, that Devin was playing a prank on me, or maybe he had blacked out and killed a wild animal or something. But that didn't make sense. Devin didn't play pranks, and he didn't black out. Should I hit the horn? No, there's no point. If my family was here and able, they'd already be outside. And if someone else was in there, they'd be waiting for us to enter. Devin started shaking again, his teeth chattering. I told him to get it together. We had to go inside and find the girls. We got out of the truck. I grabbed a tire iron and a flashlight from the back cab. I wish I had a gun, but Molly never liked them. I led Devin across the yard to the back door, which opened up to a small mudroom. Drafty and unrelenting, a breeze whistled through the interior. We entered and moved into the kitchen. The house felt cold, like deep freeze cold, like Arctic air running through it cold. My breath puffed out in large clouds. How could the temperature be this much crisper inside than out? I tried the lights, but the bulb from the overhead was gone. I saw it on the ground, shattered. I could see Devin's breath puffing out over my right shoulder in continuous bursts. He was panicking. As I was about to turn around to calm him down, a second puff of air came over my left shoulder this time. I swung around. The tire iron lifted high to swing down. Devin screamed and cowered in fear, but he was the only one there. Whatever caused that breath over my left shoulder was gone. I apologized and calmed Devin down, then led him through the empty kitchen and into the living room. It was almost completely empty. Almost. In the middle of the room, there was dirt and blood smeared on the hardwood. That must be where Devin had woken up. But stuck in the mess was a photograph. I inspected it and saw a happy family of 6, 2 parents and 4 kids. They were standing in front of the cottage, surrounded by moving boxes. At the bottom, written in pen, was the date. It was from a year ago. I checked back on Devin. His teeth were chattering and his hands were shaking. Maybe he should wait in the truck. No, keep him close. He needs his father, and I need my son. I hugged him and told him we needed to be strong and brave and go and check upstairs. He nodded and followed. Every step on the staircase creaked through the house. Honestly, this place was made out of piano keys. Every floorboard sang a note. We were in the hallway on the 2nd floor. Blood trails led to each room. Not thick, more trickles than puddles, but enough to scare a father and husband half to death. The first door was Devin's room. It was empty, as was the bathroom. We moved on to Bree's room. It was also empty. Sophie's, empty. Mine and Molly's, empty. Every trail led to where the beds would have been, and where each of the girls would have been sleeping. Where was everyone? I turned back to Devin, but he was gone. I was alone on the 2nd floor. What the fuck? Where'd he go? I rushed back down the hall, checking the other bedrooms, but there was no sign of him, and I hadn't heard a single creak when he snuck off. I rushed down the stairs, but there was no sign of anyone. The cold, it was so cold. Where was Devin and everyone else? I decided to check through the woods and down to the lake. I made my way out the front door this time, and all my questions were answered. A shovel stuck up out of the earth beside a huge mound of dirt. 3 sets of dragged heels led through the mud to a large open hole, or grave, maybe a better word. I looked down into the burial pit and saw Molly and the girls at the bottom, ankles and wrists bound. They each had stab wounds around their kidneys. They'd been bled out. The longer I stared down, the more I realized they weren't alone. My family was laying on top of 5 almost entirely decomposed bodies, what looked like 1 parent and 4 kids. I turned to vomit, but my throat closed and I clammed up when I did. Devin was standing a few feet from me, a bloody kitchen knife in his left hand. He stared at me with empty eyes. They weren't his. They were only using his, whatever they were, or it. But my son wasn't there. I gripped the tire iron, ready for Devin to take a run at me with the knife, but he didn't. He leveled the blade to his kidney and drove it into the hilt. He spasmed briefly and his body dropped. As it did, it revealed something else floating in his place, where he'd just been standing. The woman. She floated, staring at me from where my son's eyes just were. She glided towards me. I couldn't move. It was like my feet had grown roots deep in the ground. We were nose to nose now, and I saw pain and hunger burning from her empty eye sockets. Then she passed into me, and my body trembled. I couldn't move my arms or legs. My mind was fluttering, and I couldn't keep a straight thought. I felt all control of my mind and body drain away. I could only watch. And I did. I watched as my body dragged my son to the edge and dropped him in the ditch with the rest of my family, mixed with the previous one. I watched as my hands moved up and down, refilling the grave with dirt. I finished by dawn. The next thing I knew, I was driving into the city with 2 jerry cans of gasoline and a box of matches. I didn't know what we were doing or where we were going until we pulled into the parking lot of the bank I purchased the land from, the bank that repossessed the RIVEN property from its previous owner. As I watched my hands stuff rags into the openings of the jerry cans, I thought about how the father from the previous family didn't make it to the bank and wondered if I'd get closer to burning it all down than he did. The next thought that went through my head was the drive to the bank with Molly on that beautiful day to sign the papers. And that concludes episode 13 of 10 Minute Horror. We hope you enjoyed Riven, and we'll see you back here next Friday night for a brand new story.